Okay, so the topic of today's talk is the poetry of the cosmos. And what I hope to do in today's talk is to encapsulate some of the central ideas of the theosophical worldview, essentially the relationship between the macrocosm or the universe at large, when we consider the various galaxies, solar systems, or the greater aspects of our existence, and the microcosm, the individual, the personal aspects of our existence, and how these two relate to one another. So I'd like to begin with a quote from Madame Blavatsky, which I find to be, in fact, one of the most inspirational quotes from The Secret Doctrine, where it states that the whole order of nature evinces a progressive march towards a higher life. There is design in the action of the seemingly blindest forces. The whole process of evolution, with its endless adaptations, is a proof of this. So I think there's a lot in this quote, and it actually captures some of the central ideas of theosophy. First of all, the idea that nature is not static. Nothing remains still. Everything is in constant motion. And this is one of the most beautiful things we find in the cosmos. And in fact, if we look at various art forms, such as poetry, such as painting throughout history, we find that these great artists often try and capture movement. They try and capture this motion, which is fundamental to the cosmos. We also find this in the writings of all the great philosophers, the idea that nothing remains still, the idea that a person cannot walk into the same river twice, that the person changes just as the river changes, everything is constantly moving. But theosophy offers us one thing more, the idea that this movement is not random, this movement is not meaningless. It's not just movement for the sake of movement, for the sake of not remaining still. This is movement for the sake of something very particular, for the sake of progression, progression towards a higher life. And in terms of what this means, what is a higher life? Well, that's something that we will touch upon a bit later in the talk. But we also find the idea that there is design in the action of the seemingly blindest forces. So while many aspects of nature, many events which occur both in our individual lives, but also cosmically, may seem to happen randomly, may seem to happen for no apparent reason. This can be both in terms of tragedies which occur in our personal lives or in our societies, in terms of natural disasters which we see taking place, but also the more beautiful aspects of existence. Birth itself seems to be a rather blind force, the birth of new species throughout evolution, the adaptations which take place, all these beautiful changes which take place throughout nature, which may appear on the surface to be blind or random or unordered, but we find from a deeper analysis that there is design here, there is a purpose, there is a direction in which everything is heading. And so we often find this word evolution coming up again and again in the Secret Doctrine, in theosophical studies. And evolution in theosophy has somewhat of a broader interpretation than we might find in Darwin's evolution. We could say that the theosophical conception of evolution includes Darwinian evolution, but is also much greater than Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution is very focused on evolution in terms of the material plane, particularly in terms of animal life forms, whereas in theosophy, we find that evolution applies to every aspect of existence, from the atom to the nebula. Every single aspect of existence is undergoing evolution. And this is not evolution taking place through random adaptation, but evolution towards the higher life. that quote will set the tone, if you like, for today's talk, for the theme of today's talk. So the past 500 years especially, and perhaps we could narrow that down to the past 300 years, there have been gigantic leaps in scientific discoveries. And as both science and philosophy discover more about the cosmos that we inhabit, so does the sense of mystery deepen. This is an interesting paradox, because the more that we learn about the world we inhabit, the more we find, the more we discover how little we know. And we could refer to the quote from Socrates that the only thing that I know is that I know nothing. The idea that knowing, the more we discover, in fact, the more we become aware of our own ignorance. And I think that's a really interesting paradox, but it's not something to be afraid of. In fact, it just shows us how grand and how broad, how vast this universe is that we inhabit. So the greater the illuminated circle of our understanding, the vaster is the curve of the encompassing darkness. As our knowledge of the universe expands, the mystery becomes ever more profound. And it's quite interesting to compare the scientific understanding of the cosmos today to the scientific understanding of the cosmos some 300 or 400 years ago. And what we found 300 or 400 years ago was that the experts or the academics were rather certain about certain points of our existence. They like to deal in certainties. They like to deal in hard facts, the idea that we know this as a fact. This is a foundation that we can set, and from this we can understand further knowledge. And what we've come to understand is that facts are much more versatile than might be convenient, as every new fact is actually open to interpretation and open to various shades of meaning depending on future facts. Future facts affect past facts. And so the science of today is constantly developing and changing. And as our understanding of the universe expands and changes, so does the science of today change. And so does our paradigm of existence change. So if anything, we are perhaps, as a culture and as a people, we are perhaps less certain of our understanding of the universe today than ever before. And that might seem frightening on the surface, but I do believe that through a theosophical lens, this is not quite so frightening as it may come across. And so one word I would like to come back to a few times today is the word wonder, because I think that's the human quest for understanding, and from which we get such things as philosophy, science, and religion, three of which are studied in theosophy. I think all three of these things begin in wonder, in our fascination with the world, our fascination with the way things are and why things are the way they are. We are curious people. We like to question our existence and to try to understand it. And as we understand new or hidden aspects of our existence, naturally, we also like to question and better understand these. And interestingly, if we go back again some several hundred or even several thousand years, what we find is a fascination with the macrocosm. Many ancient Greek scientists and philosophers had a fascination with the stars, a fascination with the planets, a fascination with their movements and how they impacted our own existences here on Earth. There was this constant fascination and focus on out there, what was out there, what was in our universe, where do we fit within this universe. We also find this in religious cosmologies, the idea of heaven being far above, far away from the small little planets that we inhabit. And then what had happened, interestingly, over the past 100 years was a radical shift from the macrocosmic to the microcosmic. And so the focus of our wonder into the mysteries of the universe shifted from the minuscule to the immeasurably great, and then back again to the minuscule. We find this varying fascination with the two. And so at the present, we're discovering that the infinitesimal is quite as fascinating as the infinite. The microcosm is quite as fascinating as the macrocosm. Now, obviously, there has been a lot of conflict in terms of new discoveries, new understandings of the universe. It's always challenging when one's model of existence is challenged, either by new discoveries or by new theories or by new systems of thought. And looking at any event in history, we find that when a particular culture or a particular religion or a particular philosophy's system is challenged by these new discoveries, by these new ideas, there is always some conflict that results. And so since the Renaissance, science and religion have been at war over the material and spiritual aspects of the universe. And this is something that Madame Blavatsky mentioned quite a few times in The Secret Doctrine. It's something that was very much taking place at the time that she lived. And so a century ago, the increasing material vastness of our world burdened our minds and posed a threat to the spiritual focus of religion. And this is why we found such antagonism towards certain scientific ideas. Key among these, the idea that the world was, in fact, not the center of the universe, but merely one small point of a much grander universe. And so the boundaries of this physical universe were being expanded again and again to ever greater heights. We initially perceived the Earth as being at the center of the solar system, and in fact, at the center of the universe itself. We then discovered that this solar system is merely one of innumerable solar systems in our galaxy. And in fact, our galaxy is merely one of innumerable galaxies in our universe. And further, as Madame Blavatsky mentions in The Secret Doctrine, that our universe is merely one of innumerable universes incessantly coming into and out of existence. So it's an incredible shift from the idea 200 years ago that this world is essentially all there is on the physical plane, that this is our universe, to realizing how grand, how expansive this universe is. And this is all only on the physical plane that we're discussing so far. And so our view of the heavens grew from a tiny glimpse into our own solar system to a breathtaking expanse of seemingly infinite hosts of stars and worlds, sweeping continuously into view. And the cosmos that we perceive today, with our advanced telescopes such as Hubble, is an entirely different one than that which existed within the minds of our ancestors. So that's something which is also very important to consider when we look at past philosophies, past sciences, past religions. The idea is that many, at least on the outward level, on what could be perceived, and in terms of what we could see, what we could experience, a lot of this was very different from what we are able to experience on the outward level today. This doesn't mean that this is necessarily true of what we could experience on the inner levels, as there are, as the term ageless wisdom suggests, certain principles which must remain constant throughout all time. But here, if we have a look at this graph, we find this idea of the expansive perception of the universe, beginning with the Earth and our moon and the observable planets, expanding into the inner solar system, which we have discovered is in fact only one small aspect of the outer solar system, and then expanding from that to the closest stars, from that to the Milky Way galaxy, previously thought to be the universe itself, but now understood to be merely one small part of the local group of galaxies, expanding from that into even greater expanses, the local superclusters and the observable universe itself. Interesting use here of in the name observable universe, which again, today we're talking a lot about perception, right? So the idea that this is merely what can be observed. This is not the universe in its entirety. This is merely what can be observed with the current technology and current scientific development. And again, this is merely considering the physical plane of existence. So it's very easy, and I think this is unfortunately too often the case, to dismiss the material world as being somewhat unimportant or unimpressive when considered to the other planes of existence. But in fact, I think in line with the Hermetic principle of as above, so below, I think we find in our material universe such complex and intense and vast beauty and diversity that we can only imagine how this must also manifest on the other planes, on the mental planes, on the astral planes, on the spiritual planes. We can only imagine how vast these planes must be in comparison. And so with these constant changes in our perspectives of the universe, how can we discover the principles which are eternal and constant? Because that's essentially what Theosophy attempts to do as the ageless wisdom, to provide those eternal truths, those aspects of existence which remain true in all conditions, in all times, whether we are thinking on the macrocosmic or the microcosmic scale, those truths which are truly universal at all points of existence. So to again come back to this idea of the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, we'll quote from an article of the same name by G.R.S. Mead, a very prominent member of the Theosophical Society, who published in the Theosophical Review. As above, so below, doubtless enshrines some vast idea of analogical law, some basis of true reason, which would sum up the manifold appearances of things into one single verity. And I think that's always been the challenge for humanity, whether we are discussing the challenge of science, the challenge of philosophy, or the challenge of religion, or in fact, the challenge of theosophy. It's to look at the diversity of the world, the manifold appearances, and to link them together, to understand how all of these seeming diversities fit together into one unity. And this here really is the key to the previous question. How can we find an eternal principle when our understandings of the universe and our models of reality are constantly undergoing change? Also, in the Secret Doctrine, we do find a slightly more esoteric quote relating to this idea of as above, so below. Thus is repeated on earth the mystery enacted according to the seers on the divine plane. The Son of the Immaculate Celestial Virgin, or the undifferentiated cosmic protyle matter in its infinitude, is born again on earth as the son of the terrestrial Eve, our Mother Earth, and becomes humanity as a total, past, present, and future. For Jehovah, or Yod-He, Vau-He, is androgen, or both male and female. Above the sun is the whole cosmos. Below, he is mankind. So here, although we find Madame Blavatsky employing Judeo-Christian terminology, we find a principle which is universal. The idea that us as individuals, as human beings, are in fact mirrors of the universe at large, and further, that the universe is a mirror of the Logos. So there's a connection here going from the minuscule to the macrocosmic. There is a certain regularity. These principles which apply on the smallest level must also apply on the largest level. And so, as we mentioned earlier in the talk, our fascination with the cosmos has shifted from the infinite to the minuscule, from the macrocosmic to the microcosmic. The complexity of the atom, the molecule, the particle never fails to amaze the imagination. We have discovered worlds within worlds, each atom being a universe unto itself. So it's quite fascinating that while we expanded outwards in our conception of the universe and discovered just quite how large it really is, we also delved inwards to discover how vast the universe is on this microcosmic plane, on this microcosmic level. This applies not only to the world of chemistry, to atoms, to particles, to molecules. It applies also to humanity, humans being part of the microcosmic aspect of existence. We've discovered in recent years quite how complex we are as human beings, how many layers we really have, how many complexities we have to our natures, whether talking physically, psychologically, spiritually. We've discovered we're not quite as simple as we might appear on the surface. And so it seems that when we delve into one area, whether this be cosmology, whether this be chemistry, whether this be psychology, we find certain ideas which apply to all other levels. We find expanding ideas of complexity, of diversity, which apply to all other fields. And yet within this diversity, interestingly, we also find a unity and interconnectedness. And suddenly it becomes impossible to delve too far into one field without starting to move into another field. And so each discovery of the smallest aspect of nature reveals itself as a doorway to another universe. And in fact, we could reverse this quote. We could say each discovery of the greatest aspect of nature reveals itself as a doorway to another universe. So it works both ways. Every time we discover something new, we find it's not the end of the road. There's in fact an entirely new road to traverse. The boundaries are passed time and time again, and the starry constellations of the heavens are found mirrored in the atom, and vice versa. So to quote from Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, the universe is the single atom, the convergence of science and spirituality. I think this is a beautiful and inspiring quote, because if we go back what we mentioned a few slides ago, this idea of conflict between science and spirituality, or perhaps it was worded more as science and religion, but hopefully spirituality is at the heart of religion. And so what we find here is that this conflict is in fact rooted in misunderstanding and the misinterpretation of certain principles which are equally true to science and equally true to spirituality. And it's when we are able to cast aside the dogmatisms and the misinterpretations which serve to divide various avenues of inquiry that we're able to meet on common ground. And I think that's one thing which particularly inspires me about societies such as the Theosophical Society, that it seeks to find the common ground between these different areas. So while science has its objectives and its certain methods of seeking and discovering truth and does this extremely well. And while religion also does this in a way which brings about eternal truths, eternal principles, which remain as relevant today as they were when they were revealed to the world. And while philosophy does the same thing, we find that these three too often, unfortunately, fall into conflict as a result of terminology, of misunderstanding, of outward traditions, of rituals, of things which are not essential to the underlying worldview, the underlying interpretation of the world, which is again why the idea of that we find encapsulated in the motto of the Theosophical Society, there is no religion higher than truth, is incredibly inspiring. And of course, there we could switch the word religion to science or philosophy. I think the meaning wouldn't change. We could say there is no science higher than truth. There is no philosophy higher than truth. I think the essential message remains the same, and it's for all these different areas to remain focused on the truth, on the idea of discovering the universe as it truly is, instead of what fits into certain preconceived notions or dogmatisms. And when this is done, there will be a great convergence, as the Dalai Lama mentions here, that the universe can be understood through these different fields. And when they're all brought together, what we arrive at is not conflict, but a deeper understanding and a deeper appreciation for the cosmos we inhabit. And so this brings us to the idea of unity, the idea of the relation of things. So this focus, which has been heretofore shifting between the microcosmic and the macrocosmic, now shifts once again from a comparison of the macro and microcosmic to the relationship between these varying elements of the universe we inhabit. And the keynote of this relationship is unity. On examination, we discover that all things, the forces of nature, people, animals, particles, and stars, are linked together in a vast chain of life by subtle and far-reaching links, so that the entire cosmos of which we form a part is a single unity. Therefore, the cosmos is not a cluster of unrelated elements, but a unified whole, not a chaos, but an ordered kingdom. There is a unity and oneness to all life. There is an original homogeneous source from which the differentiations of substance come into existence. As we find outlined in the first stanza of the Secret Doctrine, the one manifests as the many. From here arises the multiplicity of forms in nature and the diversity of cosmic life. And yet, seemingly paradoxically, this diversity, this multiplicity remains ever one, ever unified, ever connected, and ever whole. Every part interrelates to every other and cannot exist without this interrelation to all other life. Therefore, all existence is one at the most fundamental level. And if we were to examine the key responsibility of the theosophist, the key task of the theosophist, we could perhaps state that it is to seek the one in the many, to discover the unity inherent in the vast and great diversity of life. Brings us to one of the most well-known, but perhaps also one of the most misunderstood ideas, both in theosophy and in Eastern philosophy. And in order to understand this interrelation between all things, this unity of life, it is necessary to understand karma. It is this force which links all forces, all forms of life, into a fundamental unity. And so without karma, this unity, this interconnectedness, this linking of life would not be possible. And karma is so often misunderstood as merely being some kind of system of reward and punishment. You do a good act, you have a good result. You do a bad action, you have some kind of punishment. But that's not at all the basis of karma, or the way that karma works at a fundamental level. Karma is a harmonizing principle, a force which brings equilibrium and unity to the cosmos. And therefore, we find that behind each seemingly isolated event or thing are relations which make it a part of every other event or thing. And this is a fascinating concept. And actually, there's a little test which has been done, and which became a bit of a trend for a while on the internet, is that if you go on the website Wikipedia, and you were to search for any article whatsoever, any article at all, and you were to click on the first link of this article, the first link in the article text, which hyperlinks to another article, and you were to do this again and again, and to go through a few different pages, you would eventually arrive at the page philosophy, which is really interesting. So you could take any subject whatsoever. You could start with theosophy. You could start with your favorite musician. You could start with your favorite sports team. You could start with your favorite food. It doesn't matter, any subject whatsoever. And if you were to follow the first link on every page, you would eventually arrive at the article for philosophy. And this is just an interesting idea, because it shows this interrelation between all subjects, doesn't it? And what we find here is that this interrelation between all subjects is also true on every plane of existence. It's not just true in terms of academic research or in terms of an encyclopedia. It's true because we find this in an encyclopedia because all things are interconnected. There is no isolated fact. There is no isolated aspect of existence. Everything is a part of every other thing. Every aspect of existence is intrinsically linked to every other. So this brings us to these ideas of equilibrium and rhythm as they relate to karma. So as the law by which every action must result in an equal reaction, karma may also be considered as containing a harmonizing principle. It is only by the law of karma that the universe maintains its equilibrium. Therefore, the whole cosmic process in action is according to the law of karma. So this law, sometimes called the law of cause and effect, is a universal law, which orders and balances the rhythmic workings of the world, keeping the universe in the state of perfect equilibrium. Without such constant balance and adjustment, the cosmos would simply collapse into a ravaging tempest of chaos and confusion. Atoms would burst asunder and planets fly off their courses. Scientific knowledge would become an impossibility, as there would be no laws by which to predict the patterns of phenomena. The universe would, in fact, cease to exist altogether. Now, this might seem rather extreme or hyperbolic, but if you were to consider the fact that how can we know anything? How do we know that the sun will rise tomorrow morning? How can we know the fact that one season follows another? How can we predict that rain will follow the following day, and so on? All of these predictions are based on an understanding of order. Right? If we were to exist in a world which was truly chaotic, that truly did not have fundamental principles, these predictions would be impossible. And we've proven through scientific progress and through technological progress and through societal progress over the past centuries that there must be some fundamental order to our cosmos. We are constantly using these principles, these fundamental principles, including the principle of karma, to structure our lives, to structure our scientific systems, to structure our healthcare systems, to structure our societies. All of these are in fact based on the fundamental ideas of karma and order. Therefore, we find in the writings of Plotinus and the Enneads that those who believe that the world is being governed by luck or chance, and that it depends upon material causes, are far removed from the divine and from the notion of the one. So we find even in ancient philosophy this idea that such conceptions as luck, chance, or chaos are incompatible with the conception of a divine and unified world. There simply can be no chance, there can be no randomness or luck in a world which is governed by unity and by universal principles. Everything that happens, therefore, happens for a reason. Every event can be traced to its origin, and every future event can be predicted with the right knowledge, with the right understanding of principles. And so while we started looking today at the poetry of the cosmos as something perhaps a bit frightening, as something which is, this idea that the more we learn, the less we know, this kind of idea. Well, actually, we're finding that this is not true on every level. There are universal principles which are being discovered over time through various different means, through the searches of mystics, through the analyzing of philosophers, through the experiments of science. We find all these different means on the spiritual level, on the intellectual level, on various different levels, on the physical levels. We find that all of these are leading to a greater understanding of these universal principles. And when unified, when these different fields are brought together, all we end up with is a deeper understanding of these principles. Therefore, there is no randomness in nature. The universe courses through its ceaseless cycles with clockwork constancy. To arrive at any understanding of the nature of existence and the invariable laws of the cosmos, one must first apprehend this eternal law of cause and effect, because without it there would be total chaos, and all phenomena would lack sequence or structure. Harmony, hierarchy, correspondence, order. These are all the progeny of this basic elemental law. So we can understand perhaps from this why karma is called in many theosophical writings the law of all laws, or the fundamental law. So as such, karma may be understood as a natural law, underlying all conditions and laws of phenomenal existence. Karma is the pendulum, suspended between the motion of its swing, the interrelation of everything in the eternal now. And I think this is an interesting idea because we so often think in terms of past, present, and future. We rarely pause to consider the now, the moment in which we are existing. And theosophy reveals that such ideas as past, present, and future are in essence they're an aspect of manifestation or an aspect of Maya. They are essentially rooted in illusion. Time has no fundamental reality. Everything which exists has always existed, and everything which exists has always been a unity. And the seeming differentiations, the seeming diversities are merely the shadows on the wall of the cave, to use Plato's analogy. Which is why we find that such practices as meditation and yoga are often spoken highly of, not only in theosophy, but generally in spirituality, and prayer could perhaps be included in that as a form of meditation as well. Because these practices seek to root the practitioner or bring the practitioner back to this eternal now, to living beyond the diversities of past, present, and future, to bring one back into an equilibrium with karma. And so while the fundamental condition of nature on the material plane is one of constant change, karma is that force of equilibrium which holds the polarity and diversity of life in balance. And so nature, being as full as it is of diversity and change, we find that these constructive and destructive forces in nature are engaged in perpetual warfare and struggle, the one striving to build up, the other to tear down, the result being that nothing is ever truly stable, but rather in a continual state of change. No one is the same today as they were yesterday, and no one is the same today as they will be tomorrow. Everything is in constant motion. Cycles follow cycles in an eternal progression of recurrence. Worlds, nations, units, and individuals have their birth, growth, apotheosis, and decline, and eventual death. And so while this idea that everything which comes into being must also go out of being, everything which is created must also be destroyed, in some sense, I think we have a tendency to view such words as destruction, death, in a very negative light. And that's only natural, of course. We fear both. We fear death, and we fear loss, and of course we have that emotional reaction to these things, which is only part of our humanity, of our human nature. And yet we find from the study of theosophy and of spirituality in general that death is not the end that it may seem to be. It's not the end of the road, and neither is destruction. In fact, death is simply a doorway to another life, to another path that we all must take. And it's this idea that we find in theosophy. In fact, we see this in everyday life. We see this in nature all around us, and we take it for granted. But suddenly when we consider death, we think, oh, that's nonsensical, that it can't apply there, which doesn't really make sense, because if the universe operates on universal principles, then what applies in our daily experiences, what we see in nature, must also apply on these grand levels of life and death. And so we take it for granted that spring will follow winter. We take it for granted that dawn will follow night, but we consider it to be a strange idea, an unusual idea, that life will follow death. And so I think karma, this idea of karma and this idea of the universal principles of the cosmos, can also be very comforting. It provides us with a realization of the cyclic nature of things. And so, like the ocean's tides, all existence, great and small, has its rise and fall, its ebb and flow, its rhythmic compensation. Change is in constant operation. Activity is the mechanism of nature. Nothing is stationary. All is flux. Everything flows. All is change. Everything passes. All things rise and in turn fall. Creation, destruction, and regeneration are the unremitting trinity of universal law. And so, rather than being a scary concept, something to be afraid of, I think there's something rather beautiful, something poetic in this cycle of life. In the twinkling of an eye, nature experiences a million births and a million deaths, and yet nature exists ever, birthless and deathless. This is karma, the conserver of the constant amongst the change. To recognize the beauty and extent of this interconnectedness, we need only take any ordinary, everyday event. A blooming flower in springtime, a drop of rain on the window, the lengthening of the days in summer. Each of these appear ordinary on the surface. But if one is to pause and consider the long journey that led to the occurrence of the event, one will appreciate the complexity of the interconnectedness of our world. And we could take any event whatsoever, whether it relates to our personal life, whether it relates to a natural event. Every single event can be traced back in a long chain, and an almost infinite chain of events, each connecting to many other, to countless other chains of events. So this brings us to this idea of the interrelation of knowledge, the interrelation of events, and the interrelation of facts. Every single fact, as revealed to us by science, philosophy, or other systems of thought, is a single drop in a great ocean of knowledge. We can trace the process of any fact taken for granted to the beginning of the universe itself. And if we could take these previous examples of a drop of rain, a raindrop on the window, this single event itself could be traced if we had the means, if we had the technology, if we had the understanding, back to the beginning of the universe. Every movement, each pulse of energy, each form of matter, is the last link in a chain that runs back into mystery and into eternity, to the unity of life. And I think this is quite beautifully stated by Ralph Waldo Emerson. The entire system of things gets represented in every particle. There is somewhat that resembles the ebb and flow of the sea, day and night, man and woman, in a single needle of the pine. A beautiful idea of this interconnectedness, of this fundamental cyclic nature of all things. To take another example, we could consider a seed traveling on the wind, embarking on a journey along which many interrelated parts will come into play. The seed relies not only upon the flower that brought it forth, but further upon the wind that carries it, the rain which nurtures it, the fertile soil that feeds it, and the distant sun from whose light comes its vibrant color. As above, so below. So is this fact true of every aspect of life. The cosmos is a vital whole, each part belonging to every other, affecting every other, and being one with every other. To end with a quote from Gautama Buddha, "He who experiences the unity of life sees his own self in all beings, and all beings in his own self." So if we were to consider, what can we take away on a practical level, hopefully from today's examination of the unity of life, of the poetry of the cosmos, the interrelation of all things, what can we take with this knowledge? What can we do with it on a practical level? Well, I think the Buddha said it best in this quote, the idea that it does foster in us, inevitably fosters in us, such feelings as compassion, as humility, as a deeper understanding of other people, of other perspectives, of other ways of life. We're able to recognize our own self, not only in those who are like us, not only those of our own family, our own community, our own culture, our own religion, our own belief system, but suddenly we find ourselves able to embrace everyone, all people, recognize everyone as a brother or a sister, as a fellow being in this circle of life. And this applies not only to humans, we can expand this. It applies to all of nature, to our animal brethren. It applies to the mineral kingdom, to the vegetable kingdom, to the galaxies that surround us. It applies to all levels of existence. And I think it's a beautiful idea that when we recognize that all things are unified, selfishness fades as a result, and practical changes, self-transformative changes take place in our life. And as we know, a change in any one aspect of the universe, in any one unit or individual of the universe, will have an effect on all other units, on all other aspects of the universe, which is why self-transformation is so important. By changing ourselves, we, to some extent, change the world. And I think that's something that we learn from theosophical study and practice as well. So to conclude a few of the main points now. The realization of the oneness of life brings about a shift in our conscious outlook on life. There is a duty which emerges from the realization of the true nature of our cosmos and our place within it. We must learn to think in terms much broader than those of our self-identities, our national identities, even our global identities. The study of theosophy reveals to us our place within the greater whole and how our individual lives affect and touch all other lives. In such a way, we may begin to see the cosmos not from the narrow-minded and fragmented perspective of our individual experience, but as a unity, an ordered kingdom, weaved together through all its many links and forms by relationships so essential that they may be found all around us, every moment of our lives. So with that, that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.